All right. So actually, I'm not going to get too much revenge today. In fact, I thought of changing the title to Return of the Female Nerds to do kind of a Star Wars analogy, where they changed Revenge of the Jedi to Return of the Jedi, but I thought that might be a little too geeky. So at any rate, I've become interested in this topic of female geeks and women in technology over the past 8 years that I've worked as a science and technology journalist for places like Wired and Popular Science, a bunch of American magazines that deal with these issues. And my background is actually was not originally in science or technology. I have a PhD in English. And so my experience of technical areas and how women are faring in those areas comes partly from an outsider's point of view. And I think that that's partly why I've been able to tackle this topic, because I think a lot of women who are actually working in labs and who are having to deal with checking in code every day don't necessarily have the time to worry about gender politics in the workplace because they're on deadline and they're doing important things. And so there's a lot of observations that I've been able to make and talk about that partly as a result of my position as a writer coming from outside the community. But I've also been in the community, and about 5 or 6 years ago, when I went to my first DEF CON, I'm sure you all are familiar with DEF CON, I was covering it for a newspaper, and I was really quite stunned that literally at every turn, every time I would approach someone and talk to them, I would be asked whose girlfriend I was, or whose sister I was. And I wasn't just being asked this by men, and I want to emphasize that because I don't want to turn this talk into something about how men are oppressing women or all of these problems are coming from men, because they're quite simply not. What we're talking about here is a gender problem, and we're talking about women's perceptions of themselves as well as men's perceptions of women. But it is true that in the hacking community, there is a very stark reality, which is that there are fewer women than men, far fewer women, and that those women are not perceived, those women who are here are not perceived as being as important or as worthy of respect as the men. So partly this is what drove me to edit this anthology that I've just come out with called She's Such a Geek, which has essays by 24 women talking about their careers in technology and science and video game design and comic book writing, all areas that are traditionally male-dominated geek areas. And among those women and sort of in the observations I've made as I've been working in this field, I've seen a lot of different ways that women have responded to the bias in the community. Some women have quite simply used the fact that men underestimate them as a way of gaining an advantage. It's great if you're a female hacker and people are constantly underestimating you. It allows you to take advantage of people's vulnerabilities. It allows you to get a lot more information. It's quite simply a good position to be in a lot of times if you're trying to, it's good to have people underestimate you if you want to do some social engineering. But other women have dealt with it by allowing themselves to get pushed aside out of technical jobs and into more managerial jobs or into jobs that relate more to front-end stuff or QA stuff, partly because they've constantly come up against this wall of people assuming that they're not going to be as good as their male counterparts. And still other women have simply left the technical fields that they either majored in school or started out in, just left them altogether out of disgust, out of dismay, out of just being fucking pissed off. And so, but the fact is, as I said, I'm not really here to sort of wring my hands over this and to say, gosh, there's this huge problem, women are being oppressed. What I want to do instead is take a really hard and clear look at the social forces that are causing the gender imbalance within the technical and scientific communities and how we can solve the problem that's been created. So it's not about looking necessarily at sort of what the terrible things that are happening, but just sort of what causes them and how can we fix it. And again, to look at how both genders in this equation have a problem. This isn't just a male problem. This isn't just a female problem. Everybody's getting screwed. And that needs to be fixed. So I want to begin by giving you two stories about gender And one of them is somewhat orthogonally related to this talk. But I want you to keep these stories in mind as I'm talking about some of the myths that are preventing women from coming into science and technology. The first story has to do with what happened to a gymnasium that was being built at the University of California at Berkeley, where I went to school when I was getting my PhD. So there was this really awesome gym. We all went there and rode the Stairmaster and all that crap. And it was fantastically large, but very old. And so the administration decided they wanted to rebuild the gym at great expense, and lots of alumni were giving money. So they did this huge study of how the gym was being used so that they could then rebuild the gym according to its use. So one of the things that they found was that women were using the gym 30% as much as men. And so in rebuilding the gym, what they would do is they would make the women's locker room, which had formerly been exactly the same size as the men's locker room, they would make it 30%, of the size allotted to the locker rooms. So men would get a much larger locker room and women would get a much smaller locker room. So basically what they did was instead of looking at sort of the last 50 years of history and sort of the escalation in the way women were using the gym and sort of projecting that into the future, they built a physical structure that was going to last for probably another 50 or 100 years that was based on how women had used the gym in the past. So they basically physically limited the number of women who were going to be able to use the gym based on this scientific study of how women had used it historically. So and they could argue, of course, that this wasn't gender bias, because it was just based on fact. So keep this anecdote in mind as I tell you another story, which is about DEF CON again, just because I go to DEF CON a lot, so I'm just going to pick on it. So in 2005, I was at DEF CON again, and I was actually giving a presentation. And somebody there was giving a presentation, sort of like this presentation, about female hackers. He was a male graduate student, and the fact that he was male is somewhat irrelevant, although what happened was he came up to the front of the room and he said, all right, I've been doing research on female hackers. What I know to be true is that there are no female hackers. So why is this? So as he was addressing the room, I was looking around in the room and there were dozens of female hackers in the audience. And as he continued to talk and as he continued to tell them and me that they didn't exist, they slowly left the room. By the end of his talk, they didn't exist. So this is an example of research which is a self-fulfilling prophecy. And he had gone into his research in which he had tried to reach out to hacker women to find out why they didn't exist. And he had found, indeed, that they didn't exist. So this past year, actually, I pitched a panel to DEF CON that was going to be me and two other women talking about female hackers, but it was rejected. So anyway, sorry about that. But I'm here. So I want to use these anecdotes to frame the way we're going to talk about gender inequalities in computing as a social problem. Because I want us to think about two basic issues when we're talking about women in computer science, women in technology and engineering, which is, first of all, how do you use statistics about those things that are based in the past in order to plan for the future? Because, of course, we're assuming that the future of women in computing will be very different from the past. And also, how do you study something that so many people are claiming doesn't exist? So the other thing I want to mention before I continue is that I have some basic underlying assumptions that I'm going to have in this talk. One of them, as I've said to you probably like 13 times already, is that gender inequality is a problem for both men and women. Men are harmed just as much by gender roles as women are. Men are harmed when they don't have access to the knowledge of 50% of the population in their workplaces. They're harmed by social expectations about childcare just as much as women are. Blah, blah, blah. I'll talk more about that later. The other thing is, I absolutely am not interested in having a debate about whether women have as much technical and scientific aptitude as men. They do, end of story. If you want to have a debate about that, go somewhere else. The other thing is, The other thing is, as I've said, historical statistics aren't helpful, although I'm going to look at a lot of historical statistics with you, so I'm sort of, a bit wishy-washy on that point. And as I said already, my other assumption is that women in high tech and the sciences do exist. I know them, you know them, a lot of them are in this room. Yeah, okay, so we know that that's the case. So let me talk about some of the statistics that get bandied around a lot when people talk about women in science and technology. This first set of statistics that I have up here are from a National Science Foundation study that looked at women in computer science over a period of a little over, 15 years. Sorry, I'm having a little mathematical problem here. And so this is a very often quoted statistic because in 1985, women held 36% of bachelor's degrees in computer science. These are all, unfortunately, statistics from the United States, so I'm sorry about that. I didn't have access to comparable European statistics, but I'd like to hear if there are statistics like that for Europe, and particularly for Asia, because I think actually the recent study from the National Academy of Sciences in the United States has found that actually these statistics don't hold so much for Asia. But at any rate, so then in 1995, women held only 28% of bachelor's degrees in computer science, and then in 2001, they held only 27% of them. So this was touted a lot in the media when it came out as sort of women's participation in computer science is in decline. Women only held 13.6% of computer science jobs in 2001. So this was cited as an example of, well, we tried to push women into computer science, but they naturally fell away from computer science. Now, one way to look at these statistics, which I think is quite interesting, is if we're looking at women's participation in technology as a social issue and women's participation as a response to social forces, in the United States, there was a strong conservative tendency in the country during the late 1980s, which is when a lot of the women who studied that 28% and that 27% of women were starting to study computer science. And so if you look at this as a trend in sort of social conservatism, what you're seeing is as the United States grows more socially conservative, it produces fewer and fewer women who are going into computer science and the sciences generally. Whereas in 1985, a lot of those women had grown up during the 1970s, which was a period of relative liberalism in the United States, and there was also a lot of social funding for programs that encouraged young women to go into math and science and computer science fields. Now, the other thing that's really interesting, and this is my favorite statistic in the entire universe, which is in the same 2001 study that told us, oh, women only have 27% of computer science degrees, it also pointed out that women held 56% of bachelor's degrees in the sciences overall. However, they only held 25% of jobs in science and engineering. And then as a comparison, I noted that women held 57% of bachelor's degrees in the life sciences and 34% of those jobs. Now, what you're seeing there, if you're concerned about this aptitude issue, is that, yeah, women totally have an aptitude for science and engineering, but somehow the job market doesn't know it. Somehow there's this huge drop-off between the aptitude that young women show while getting their degrees, and then when they hit the job market, that evaporates. So what we're seeing is a social problem, not an intellectual problem on the part of women. We're seeing a problem with women getting jobs. And also, just for like some sugar on top of your statistics, because you can never have enough statistics, I just wanted to add that there was this very interesting study in the late 90s by the Swedish Medical Research Council that showed that women had to work 2.2 times more than their male counterparts in order to get grants and financial support. So again, what you're seeing is a kind of social problem around women succeeding in their fields. And what I want to do now is pull back and give you a final chunk of statistics to look at the big picture and to see where women are trending in computer science as a field over the past several decades. This chart, oh, it looks much better up here than it does on my screen. It actually starts in 1966, where you see 0.0% of women in engineering and computer science fields. And then you do see a gradual trend upward. So you're seeing that the dip that we were talking about, but it's still a gradual trend upward. And this is precisely the sort of pattern you would expect to see if the issues around women participating in technology were social issues. Women obviously have not grown new brains over the past few decades. I mean, that would be awesome if we were, because I'd love to have a bigger brain. But actually what we're seeing is specifically a social trend. Women are increasing their visibility in many, many areas, including in science and engineering. And so we're still seeing this general upward trend as a result of social transformations, not like nanotechnology getting into our brains and making us like cyber women or whatever. If any of you actually saw the Doctor Who episode with the cyber women, you know how terrible that would be. Actually, sorry, that wasn't Doctor Who, that was Torchwood. Okay, there's a Billy Piper supporter in the audience. Can you get him out of here? No, we're not going to tolerate any Billy Piper in here. Okay, so what else did I want to mention about that? That's what I wanted to mention about that. So basically the question is, now we get to the meaty part. Now we kind of move beyond statistics and into a realm that pretty much only sort of humanities types have gone into before, which is, how do we make sure that that trend we were looking at continues to go upward? How do we make sure that more and more women are entering the fields of computer science and engineering and other sciences? In other words, how do we make the future safe for female geeks? How do we have more Grace Hoppers with those awesome glasses that she's got on there? And so basically, in order to talk about that, what I'm going to do is take us into a detour into the realm of mythology and fantasy. Because it's my contention that one of the main things that's holding women back in these areas is myths about what women are capable of. And these are myths that women have internalized, they're myths that men have internalized, they're myths about how the sexes interact with each other. No one is really to blame. This is not about like men have imposed X and Y on us and women have done blah, blah, blah as a result. This is really about social myths that we all buy into and that we all need to stop buying into if we want to change the gender ratio. So myth number one, I bet you've all heard this myth about 1 million frickin' times. Women aren't interested in technology. It's always the thing where you'll hear the boy saying, "Oh, well, I like hacking, but my girlfriend doesn't like it, and that's just because women don't like tech." Or women will say, "Oh, I'm just a girl, so I'm not interested in tech." Obviously, that's crap. We know that that's not true. Here's just a few lovely examples of women in history who've been interested in computers, whose images I've appropriated from the internet, except for the image of the women from Survival Research Laboratories who gave me permission to use it. At any rate, Ada Lovelace, obviously, many have credited with inventing the first computer language. Women were heavily involved in doing programming on early computers in the 1940s. Women continue to be interested in programming computers. I don't need to prove this to you, but the pictures are there. And one of the things I wanted to say about that is that this whole idea that women aren't interested in technology is what leads directly to kind of clueless statements such as, "There are no women hackers." That leads to somebody literally standing where I'm standing right here, where I can see a shitload of women in this room, and lead someone to be in this exact position and say, there aren't any women here, because people are so under the spell of this myth that women just don't like technology. How do we combat this myth? Well, it's very easy. I mean, basically, it's all about visibility. It's about paying attention to these kinds of images, paying attention to these kinds of examples, and also paying attention to the women around us and saying, oh yeah, that woman is interested in technology. Duh, why didn't I think of that before? Please don't quote me on the duh thing, although I guess this is being recorded. But anyway, so that's a pretty simple myth. The next myth is a little bit more complex and has a lot of layers that I want to get into. There's this myth that, first of all, one of the assumptions in this myth is that people who do technology are smart. So we're not going to interrogate that myth. We'll just assume that people who do technology are smart. But then there's this myth that smart women aren't attractive. In other words, women who do technology are not attractive. And the double whammy is women should be attractive, right? So the problem is that if a woman wants to be attractive or somehow values being attractive because she wants to get laid just like all of us do, that she shouldn't be playing with computers because that will make her not attractive. And this, I have these images up here. They're images from Ice Princess, a really amazing American film, as well as another American film called She's All That. These are both, She's All That is from the late 90s and Ice Princess is from the noughties. These are both narratives, and particularly She's All That was a very popular film in the United States. I don't know if it made it over to Europe or not, but it was basically about a girl who's a geek. She's a high school nerd. She likes to make art out of circuit boards, and she's really weird and wears glasses. That's the picture of her up at the top in her nerd outfit, in which the film is trying to tell us she's not attractive. She meets a nice boy, and through her sexual involvement and heterosexual yayness or whatever, she learns that what's really important is being pretty. And so she becomes prettier at the end. The guy who's gotten involved with her, it's one of those farces where he did it on a dare, but then he really falls in love with her, blah, blah, blah. They go to the prom together, and she's completely, basically given up on her geekiness and her art by the end of the film. She's been redeemed by the love of a good man and discovering that she's actually pretty. Now, the way that this fits into, and Ice Princess has a similar premise where the young woman is a physics genius, and she decides she wants to become a pretty ice skater instead of going to Harvard. And yeah, she gets to wear really cute outfits. And those of you who watched the last few seasons of Buffy the Vampire Slayer will recognize that is Dawn, Buffy's annoying younger sister, who got to play the Ice Princess. So now this is I sort of make jokes about this because it's easy to joke about, but one of the ways that this myth is particularly poisonous for women who are working in the fields of technology is that it sets up a dichotomy between being sexually appealing in any way and working with men in the workplace. And if you're going to be a woman in technology, you're going to have to work with men. It's very important that women get mentored by men just as much as they get mentored by women. Many of the people who mentored me were men. Many of the women who have achieved high levels within their fields in technology and science have been mentored by men. But because of this myth, there's a really strong push to keep men from mentoring women because there's this idea that women might at any moment become sexual. They might somehow, if they're being mentored by a man, other people might look at that relationship as being somehow potentially a sexual relationship. And so they might assume, well, because this woman is working with this male mentor, maybe it's just because she's secretly giving him blowjobs in his office. Or, it doesn't have to be that literal, right? It could be, it's just that he wants to have sex with her. So he's mentoring her not because she's genuinely bright, but because he has some kind of sexual interest in her, or vice versa. She has some sexual interest in him, and therefore the relationship is taken out of the realm of the professional, and it becomes not, say, an honor that this woman has worked with a prestigious man in her field, but something that's suspicious. And this is a myth that really poisons both women and men in the workplace and their ability to work together, because there's this idea that, as I said, at any minute, a woman might become sexual and create some kind of problem, or undermine the work that's going on, or undermine her own credibility, or undermine the credibility of the men around her. And so busting this myth is more than just saying, let's not gossip about people's sex lives. It's about encouraging men and women to work together in mentoring relationships and workplace relationships without worrying that, it might become sexual, or without assuming that means that the women around them have become desexualized. The fact is, when men and women work together, some people might have a little sex, just like when a bunch of men work together. Some of the men are going to have sex with each other. It happens. It's not a big deal. The fact is, most people aren't doing that. Most people who have workplace relationships and mentoring relationships are just doing it because they love the work and because they want to get guidance. So that's a really important myth that we need to be busting. And like I said, one of the ways to bust the myth is just encourage men to mentor women in the workplace and encourage those relationships to happen and not assume that they have some ulterior meaning. Here's my final myth that I want to talk about tonight, which is, again, an incredibly pervasive myth, very multi-layered. The myth is, quite simply, that women would rather have family and pay attention to babies than stay up all night coding in the lab or stay up all night doing whatever it is that they're doing in the lab with, if it's biotech or whatever. There's this notion that when men take jobs, that they will have a spouse who may take care of a baby, and that they won't be distracted by things like reproduction, but that women have some kind of either biological urge or social pressure to do that. The new study that's come out from the NAS, this is a little bit of stuff that I'll get to in a minute that's up on the slide right now. The new study from the NAS dealt with this myth a lot. One of the really depressing statistics from an earlier study showed that 35% of unemployed female scientists and engineers cite family responsibilities as the reason why they are not working in their chosen fields. So this isn't a small thing. One of the interesting things about the new National Academy of Sciences study that just came out a few months ago, by the way, is that they explored this a lot more. And one thing that they found was that when women get letters of recommendation from supervisors, their family lives are mentioned 6 times more often than men's family lives are mentioned. Now, there's nothing wrong with mentioning someone's family life, but when you see a pattern like that, what you're seeing is the building up of this myth, again, that women are associated with the family, and that being associated with the family means that they won't somehow be as competent as men are or as focused as men are in the workplace. Now, again, what's interesting, and the reason why I put up these 2 examples of propaganda here, one from the 1940s during World War II in the United States, and one from 2006 in the United States, is that we can clearly see a relationship between social propaganda and women's roles. This picture to your right, no, to your left, my right, is of Rosie the Riveter, who's an incredibly famous icon. And this was during a period of time when women were being encouraged to take science and engineering jobs because men were at war during World War II. And a lot of women did move into those jobs as a result of this kind of propaganda. And now, today, we're seeing something of the opposite propaganda at work, where you get, for example, I love this, it's so amazing. This article that appeared in Esquire quite recently has sort of broken the blogosphere in half. Everybody's been pissy about it. At any rate, there's this fantastic physicist named Naomi Halas who's done amazing work with nanoshells and is sort of revolutionizing the way we understand nanotech. And this profile of her in Esquire has this whole section where it talks about how she was married and how she didn't have kids and what that meant to her. And think about how silly that would sound if it was a guy. Can you imagine saying, happily married for 20 years to a theoretical physicist he met at IBM. He was unable to have children. Maybe, he thinks, he was meant to do this instead. Again, there's nothing incredibly poisonous and horrible about this. It's not saying she's a bad physicist because she has breasts. And that's a picture of her, by the way, looking a lot like Rosie the Riveter, which I kind of like, Rosie the Riveter with a computer. But instead, what it's suggesting is that women, again, are more associated with children and families than they are with professional work. And so this is just a pervasive myth that we see again and again and again, where women's competence and women's dedication is constantly undermined by this reference to the fact that they might reproduce or that they might not reproduce, and that somehow that would be relevant to their work lives, which it's not. And I think that this is partly a result of growing conservatism in the United States, that we're seeing a lot of this stuff. I don't know that there's an equivalent type of propaganda in Europe. But there is, the US is obviously going through a pretty wacky time politically, shall we say. So we're seeing a lot of this stuff. And the problem is that, first of all, women are placed in a position where they're told they have to choose between work life and home life. The other problem is men aren't told that. So men who, when they have children, naturally love those children and want to help raise those children because they're their children, are told, oh, well, you don't even have a conflict over that. We aren't even going to go there. So you're, of course, going to be at the office, even if your daughter's having a piano recital or is sick or whatever. Of course, the women will take care of that. So the women get screwed over because they're saddled with having to take care of the sick kid. The men get screwed over because they don't get to go take care of their sick kid, who they're probably worried about all night long as they're checking in code, and it's taking them longer to work because they're worried. So this is a situation that sucks for everybody. And as I said, I think there's a few simple ways to fix it. One is to not assume that women's reproductive lives and personal lives have anything to do with their work lives. The other thing to do is to assume that men may have personal lives that affect their work lives. And to sort of make work policy accordingly. So as a final moment, a final coda in this talk, again, I want to talk about making new fantasies about women and new mythologies about women to kind of combat these crappy old mythologies that I've been pissing all over for the last several minutes. So, as I said, we need to do more than combat these myths. We need to counter-propagandize, which means in some cases doing things that are as silly as focusing on images of fictional women who are competent at technology and who revel in technology. It means maybe watching cheesy 80s movies like Real Genius to get an image of a geek who is incredibly competent. How many people have seen Real Genius? It's kind of a cheesy American movie. Yeah, anyway. And so most of you haven't. But at any rate, it's a story about a bunch of geeks at Caltech in California, a famous technical school. And the main character, Mitch, is a really young guy. He's the one who's male in that upper picture. He meets this fantastic electrical engineer who helps him sort of fight against this professor who's trying to invent a new nuclear weapon. And she's always inventing things, and she's just completely insanely hyper. And she's just a real female geek. She's not. She doesn't look like Trinity. She looks more like a real geek. But she's a very positive image. And then there's Trinity, who actually used InMap in a movie, which made Fyodor extremely happy. If you ever ask him about it, he'll do a little dance for you. And she's a kick-ass woman. She's not put into some kind of lower position relative to the men, although in the first Matrix movie, I don't know if you remember, but of course Neo says to her, "Oh, Trinity, I thought you were a guy." But no, she's a chick, and she kicks ass, and she's highly technical. So these are some counter fantasies to these pervasive fantasies about women sort of spawning babies and having sex all the time and not necessarily being technical. The other thing, obviously, and everyone always says this, but I'm going to say it again, is female nerds need to organize with each other. But also, and this is just a list of women's groups or female-dominated groups like Dorkbot, which is not a women's group, but in San Francisco it's dominated by a woman. She runs it. There's this book that I've done called She's Such a Geek, which a lot of the women involved in it are now kind of networking with each other. And then there's a lot of these other groups like Linux Chicks and the Hexen and Blog Her, which are all women's-oriented technical groups. However, I want to give you my coda, which I think I've said about 15 times, which is it's not just about women networking with each other. It's about men and women networking with each other. It's about men helping women as much as women help women. Because given that there's more men in technology, men are going to need to help us. So men help us by hiring women and by mentoring women and by organizing with women and coming to women's events and telling them, hey, I've got a job at my company. We'd really like to hire you. And we won't ask you to speak in girl language when you come. So my final thought for you is that this is really all about fighting for the future. We're all geeks. We fight for the future. We fight to make the future a better place. And in combating these myths about women's identities and in combating the problems that women are encountering in the workplace and encountering as they try to enter into technology, we get to do something that we all love doing, which is fighting for the future and fighting to make the future awesome and not like in, I'm just going to pick on the show Torchwood, which probably none of you have actually watched, but in the show Torchwood, they fight to stop the future. I never quite understood why they did that, but we're fighting to start the future for women. So the message is, fight to bring women more into technology, don't watch Torchwood, and thank you very much. Are there questions? Do we have a microphone?
Hi. I noticed that you are dressed in a masculine fashion. You're wearing a suit. You have short hair. I'm wondering how you feel that gender presentation affects women's role in the workplace. Do you hear stories of women finding themselves taken less seriously when wearing a dress?
I have heard stories actually from both sides. It's interesting because there's an essay in my book, not that I'm plugging my book like every 30 seconds, but it's actually by a woman who prefers to dress in dresses, and she's an astronomer, so she has to do a lot of hiking out to remote areas. And she had a lot of trouble initially because the men would sort of say like, oh, well, you're wearing a dress, you won't be able to like climb this ladder or go up this pathway. And she really had to fight to convince them that actually, in many ways, wearing a dress is more comfortable when you're hiking. And she points this out repeatedly. But I think that there's problems if you go the other way too. For example, if you do, say, choose to wear a vintage suit and cut your hair very short, I think that people sometimes assume that you're trying to take on the role of a man or be too masculine or you're a dyke because they're completely clueless about what genderqueer is and what dyke is. And actually, probably a lot of people are clueless about that. But the point is that I think that really the problem is that women have to worry way too much about how they look. I mean, we constantly have to come up against that question. And I know that, yeah, but and men have to worry about it too, but it's just not as intense. I mean, men sometimes get anxiety about, am I wearing a suit or can I just wear a t-shirt? But I think that part of what we need to be doing is making sure that women are able to dress in whatever way is comfortable for them and have whatever form of gender presentation that they want to have. I mean, it would be great. I'm going to just have like a tiny tangent, but it would be great if men could do that too. I always think it sucks that like I can wear a suit, but a guy can't come up here and wear a dress without suffering potential violence. And I know so many men who love to wear dresses, and it's like, you know, so, I mean, yeah, so I think that yeah, I mean, it's obviously always, it's obviously an issue, and I'm hoping that we're going to move beyond that. So it's a good question.
Hello.
Hello.
I would like to ask if you have found any statistics or did some research to prove the claim that mentoring relationships that you talked about between men and women are not sexually motivated, because I have seen more than one case where they were.
Well, and
sorry.
That is, no, I mean, okay, there's grumpy noises. I think it's important to be able to ask those questions. I think that yes, there have been many, many studies that have shown, in fact, MentorNet, which is a group I had posted up there, has done a lot of studies on how mentoring works between women, and there's no reason to assume that many of the relationships between men and women work just as well. Certainly, relationships between men also become sexually charged. I don't know if any of you guys have heard of a guy named Alan Turing by any chance. He might have been fucking a boy or two that he was working with, and I think it probably turned out okay. So I think that, yeah, I mean, I think what we have to acknowledge is that there's always going to be a tiny percent of people, regardless of their gender, who are going to have sex with their mentors. And the vast majority aren't going to, whether the relationship is between a man and a man and a man, or a woman and a woman. And the fact is that if our workplaces are going to become gender integrated, we're going to have to stop worrying so much about whether male and female mentoring relationships are sexual and assume that, in general, they aren't. Sure, there's always going to be examples where they are, but...
I agree completely, of course. I just wanted to point out that examples are not the same as statistics, because I thought that was a bit confusing sometimes. You mentioned Turing, of course, because he was gay. But that, I mean, it's one example. It's exactly like Miss Lovelace. And I think sometimes that came across a bit as a mix-up between this is a statistic and this is an example, because an example does not prove a trend.
Right, so nor do your examples prove a trend. So yes, we're agreed that anecdotes don't equal statistics, so yeah. Good.
Right. This is coming back to the mentoring question a little bit from a different tact. One thing that was interesting, I recently taught an introductory computer science course, and I did this partially because I didn't have any requirement to do so, but I thought, well, it would be good for me to mentor young women in computer science because, you know, this is something that women are told is a good thing to do. And I was incredibly chagrined to find out that my section of, you know, young freshmen were all male. And at first I said, why am I doing this? And then I realized, and I think that we've talked about men mentoring women and women mentoring women, but women mentoring men is also, I think, incredibly useful at you know, busting these myths, because, you know, there are a bunch of Harvard freshmen, male Harvard freshmen, that know that they learned C from a girl. And I think that that's important, you know? So yeah. I think that, you know, women should consider mentoring in general as a good thing to, you know, put your expertise out there and help younger people in general too.
Yeah, I think that's right, yeah.
Yeah, I was going to add on to that. I mean, I've done, I'm a hacker, I've spoken at conferences for several years, and I finally stopped talking to reporters about, oh my God, what's it like to be the girl hacker? You know, frankly, I'm not interested in talking to them about that. I want to talk about backbone security. I want to talk about cryptography. One of the best things that I think you can do to help women in the field is just treat us like nerds. Geek on out with us. Don't get so hung up on, oh my God, girl, oh my God, girl. You know, I don't go to my Linux users group to pick up dudes. I go to talk about Linux.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yay. I would want to add to what Raven was saying, that what she's talking about is kind of the flip side of the invisibility problem, because there's this problem of people saying, you know, female hackers don't exist, but then there's the other side where if there is a female hacker, she receives so much weird attention, or aberrant attention, or I'm not sure how to describe it, but attention that a male hacker wouldn't receive, that it's very uncomfortable. And so you get that simultaneous feeling of being invisible and then looked at all the time. And both things kind of suck. And as Raven says, the goal is just treat her like a nerd. She's just another nerd. She's got an OpenBSD shirt too. I have one too. Yay!
Yeah, hello. What do you think about laws which force companies to employ at least 50% women? Are they helpful or maybe harmful?
It's hard to say. I don't know of any laws that force companies to employ 50% women.
In Norway, there are some.
I'm sorry?
In Norway, I heard
In Norway? Wow. 40%. The question really is about quotas. Like, what does that do? I really go back and forth on that question. I kind of have to say I have to take the sort of wishy-washy way out, which is to say it's good and bad. It can be good because it forces people to consider candidates that they might not otherwise consider, because let's face it, I mean, I've done hires, many of you have done hires. We tend to hire people who are either our friends or recommended by our friends, or people who remind us of our friends. And if we tend to be friends with people of the same sex, that means that if we get two candidates, one is the opposite sex and one is the same sex, we may just unconsciously gravitate toward the candidate who is more like us. And a lot of studies have shown that happens not just with gender but also with race. And a lot of these same problems come up for racial minorities. But on the other hand, it can create a lot of divisiveness in the workplace, because what happens is when women or other kinds of minorities are hired under affirmative action programs, they often get treated like second-class citizens. People say, oh, well, she was only hired because she was a chick, not because she's an awesome coder. So I don't know. I wish I had a good answer. I don't know how to reconcile those two things. I think there has to be some policy in place in a workplace that's completely male-dominated, like so many computer engineering workplaces, and especially security-related computer science, is so male-dominated. There has to be some push toward hiring women, but I think forcing a quota is too much. So I don't know what the middle ground is, but I think it would be nice to explore some kind of middle ground. So I'm sorry that that's kind of a yes or no answer, but it's a very hard question.
Yeah, I have something to say about that, actually. I work for a technology company that's 60% women. And we recently had to hire a number of technical positions. And we found, actually, that the high percentage of women in our organization was perceived as valuable and helped us recruit both men and women to the organization because it was the environment they wanted to work in.
Cool. So the more women you have, the better programmers you'll get. Takeaway message.
Well, hi. The title of this lecture somehow has the word revenge.
I know, I'm sorry about that.
And let me indulge myself for asking this question, but why revenge and why the aggression?
Well, so as you may have noticed, the talk itself was probably not as aggressive as revenge, but it's actually just a joke reference to an American movie from the 1980s called Revenge of the Nerds. And this is a movie in Revenge of the Nerds, and there's a lot of female nerds in the movie, by the way. And what happens is the nerds are oppressed and by the jocks, the guys who play sports, and then the nerds rise up and overthrow the guys who play sports. But in the end, they all make friends. So if you, yeah, it's kind of like, basically what I'm trying to say is it was a cheesy pop culture reference, and I'm sorry that it came across as aggressive. It might have worked better in a more United States-centric environment, but yeah, it's just a cultural reference.
Well, indulge myself for my lack of geek knowledge.
Yeah, I'm sorry. It was, yeah.
So I'm one of those people that would really like to think of myself as a person who doesn't discriminate based on gender or any other factor other than what the person knows and how they're able to perform. I know that because of societal conditioning, that's not 100% the case, but for somebody who actively tries to look for somebody who knows what they're talking about as opposed to whether they have breasts or not, what do you suggest as advice for trying to maintain some sort of equality or just trying to make things better for all that you're seeing from your point of view in the industry or academics or anything? Basically,
I would hope that you would just keep doing what you're doing. I mean, what you're doing, trying not to discriminate based on people's gender, trying to interact with them purely as in terms of knowledge and in terms of what they have to offer. I think the problem that I'm seeing is that it's not enough. Mm-hmm. There needs to be some sort of extra step taken. But if the steps taken are too much, then it's immediately viewed as this is affirmative action. Right. You're only hiring somebody because she's female. What do you think is the appropriate response to show that, no, really, I really don't give a shit whether she's a guy or not, or, you know. And yet you do want to make sure that there's more women in the workplace. You know, it's what do you do to show that I really don't care about gender discrimination, but I'm hiring this person based on her skill set or his skill set as opposed to any sort of discrimination. Right. Well, I think what I'm hearing you ask is, you know, just sort of being non-discriminatory in everyday life isn't enough. You feel like you need to do something more assertive to get more women into your workplace or something like that. And I think there are a lot of ways you can do that without kind of stepping all the way over into saying we need 50% female employees. One is, as I suggested, networking with women. There's a lot of women's groups. There's a women's group here at this conference that has meetings every day or some days, or anyway, they're hanging out here. The Hexen, and I don't know if any of them are here, but I'm sure they would say hi to you later. But the point is that if, in the same way that if you were trying to hire for a position, you might network with other people at a conference like this, make an effort to
Well, here's a scenario.
Okay.
What would you do in the case where, say, one of my coworkers is brutally incompetent?
Okay.
And this coworker happens to be female. And she's not qualified for her job whatsoever. She was not hired because she's female, but she's hired because she's a friend of the boss. How do you approach that situation in a way that you can say it's not because you're female, it's not because of any other thing, it's a matter of technical standards and you don't qualify?
Yeah, I mean, I think the answer is obvious that
but
if it's
the
somebody
first response is it's a gender issue.
Well, then I think you have to have a lot of evidence to show that this person is not technically competent, which shouldn't be very difficult to do, because if somebody is technically incompetent, there will be evidence. And I mean, you guys are hackers. Come on. Show the holes in her code.
Hackers and management don't always get along.
Yeah, I know. But, it's like, take her code apart and, make sure for yourself and for others that this is about technical skills and not about gender.
Okay, thank you.
Can you go? Okay. I've got a quick anecdote, and then I also wanted to speak about the whole affirmative action thing. The quick anecdote was when my mother was one of the 2 female lawyers in our hometown in the 80s, she always made a particular point to wear dresses. And then as soon as, the early 90s rolled around and there started to be more women enrolled in law school than men, she was like, screw this, I'm wearing pantsuits. So she was doing her own little affirmative dressing kind of thing.
Well, I think it's that the more women you have, the more freedom there is for women to act however they want.
Well, the less that it matters what you look like.
Yeah.
Yeah. The other thing that I wanted to bring up, the whole affirmative action thing, I think my view is that the benefits accorded to people by virtue of having any sort of quota system in place are just so torn down by the whole, by being questioned whether or not they've been brought in on an affirmative action plan, like, oh, you're only here because you're group X, Y, or Z. The university I go to, University of Toronto, has gone through a big debate over the past couple of years about affirmative action and hiring practices specifically, and especially within science and technology. The approach that they've come up with, they call it casting a wider net, and the idea is basically looking at making your hiring practices more inclusive, but not in a way that focuses on a specific axis of oppression, axis of orientation, that kind of thing. It's looking at structural inequalities within your hiring practices and dealing with those on a case-by-case basis, as opposed to having any sort of quota system in place. So it's worth looking into the equity office at U of T, because they've got some cool documents.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah, well, we are running out of time, so if there are any further questions, I'd suggest you move to outside, because otherwise the following lectures will get delayed.
Okay, thank you very much. Also, I have 2 copies of my book, and if you can make a really persuasive case that you need it, I will give one of them to you.